Hello everyone. So today we are gonna keep going on the conferences you started this morning and focus on machine learning. So this morning you learned about the principles of machine learning, and now we are gonna try to understand how it can apply to journalism and how it can help in the newsroom. So first we're going to talk with Peter Aldous, who is a reporter at the Science Desk at BuzzFeed News, US. So you have written a lot of stories using code and machine learning, so maybe you could talk to us a little bit more about some of the applications you made of machine learning while...
Sure. So let me, first off, can you now see my screen with a slide on it?
Yes.
Great. So, to follow up on what you said, I guess I've done a lot of stories with code. I've only done one sort of body of work with machine learning, and it's this. It's about, you can see an aircraft in the middle of that artwork. And back in, I guess the machine learning part was done in 2016. I did a series of stories that were based around identifying spy planes or surveillance aircraft by machine learning. So let me sort of take a step back and talk about the data I was working with here. So part of it was fairly straightforward. It's just registration information on the aircraft, which I got from the Federal Aviation Administration. The more interesting part of the data came from this website, Flight Radar 24, which has tracking data on a lot of aircraft. And here you see I'm highlighting a helicopter that's operated by the Los Angeles County Sheriff. Now, we got bulk data from Flight Radar 24. I got 4 months of flights for the last 4 months of 2015 in the first instance in a bounding box around the United States. So that was the data set I initially worked with. And this is what the data looks like, just so you get a sense of what the raw data is. Every row is a ping from a transponder on an aircraft. The stuff to the left, up to where it says timestamp, comes from Flight Radar 24. So you can see you're getting latitude and longitude coordinates, altitude, speed. Track is a compass bearing 360 degrees around a circle. Squawk is a code that's given off by the transponders, which mean various things. It so happens that that one we're looking at, 4401, is reserved for federal law enforcement. And then to the right, we have the information from the FAA. So this is telling us that this aircraft we're looking at, which is a small turboprop plane, is operated by US Customs and Border Protection, part of the US Department of Homeland Security. So that's the raw data I was working with from two sources. Now, most planes do this, right? They go from A to B. So we're looking there at 1 day of flights over North America and in and out of North America from another project I did. Spy planes don't do that. They do this. This is the cumulative tracks of 4 months of FBI and Department of Homeland Security planes over Southern California with animation of the individual flights over the top of that. So that comes from the first article we did on this topic. No machine learning at that point. And just so you know what we're talking about, here are some of the characters in that initial story. On the left, there's a plane from Customs and Border Protection, part of Department of Homeland Security, in uniform, if you like. On the right, I guess we have the plainclothes version of federal law enforcement in the air. That is an FBI plane. It's operated by a front company. You won't see FBI in the registration database. These planes, they have cameras, they do video surveillance, and a bunch of other electronic surveillance, which may sometimes include tracking cell phones from the air. So, and back in April 2016, with a colleague at NYU, Charles Seif, we did a story looking at those FBI and DHS planes and their patterns of activity. But that led me to another question. Like, I'm sitting on all of this data, 4 months of data. What other spy planes might be in it? So given I had a lot of data, it's very high quality data, I thought, well, this seems like an opportunity to train a machine learning algorithm on the aircraft and the flight characteristics of these known spy planes, and then set it loose on the 4 months of data and see if I can find anything that looks similar. And, you know, there are tens of thousands of aircraft and hundreds of thousands of flights in that data, so it was not possible to do this manually. Now, I did process the data, and this to me is one of the messages, is that you don't have to do machine learning on your raw data. You can think about how to engineer it. It's sometimes called feature engineering, to give an algorithm more to work with. So to give you an idea of what I did, this is for, I believe, this is a histogram of the number of transponder detections at different altitudes from a random sample of, I think, 500 of aircraft in that data, after I'd taken out the obvious airliners and such, which I knew I wasn't interested in. So you can see they fly at different altitudes, and then I've divided that into quantiles. So there are equal numbers of transponder detections between those dotted vertical lines. And having done that, for any individual aircraft, I was able to say, over all the observations to it, how much of its time proportionally was it spending in each of those bands. And that is essentially what I did for a whole bunch of variables. I did it I did it for the duration of the flights, you can see here, for the area of bounding boxes around those flights, for the speed the plane were flying at, a whole bunch of other things, including, crucially, something I called the steer, which is basically a change in compass bearing between observations. So it's a measure of turning rate. So I went from having many, many rows for each aircraft to having one row for each aircraft and many, many variables created in that way. Then the algorithm I used is something called the random forest, which is a sort of good general discrimination algorithm to use on data like this. It's basically made up of what are called decision trees. It's like a consensus of decision trees. And over to the right, you can see a representation of a decision tree. Basically, the data, which is being divided into two categories, is coming around to these decision points where a question is asked about the data and then it goes either way. And you're building trees statistically to try and separate the data. And the random forest is, like, as I said, a consensus of many trees. You can think of it in simple terms. It decides what's important in the data. I didn't tell it what I thought was important in the data. I just fed it those variables, and then I was getting it to, I trained it on the known spy planes versus the sample of 500 randomly selected planes, which are unlikely to be spy planes. And these charts show the variables that the model decided, the algorithm once trained, decided were important. And you can see right up at the top are steer 1 and steer 2. Those represent hard turns to the left, which is not surprising given that the pattern of these planes is mostly counterclockwise or anti-clockwise circling. The other one that's near the top is squawk 1. That's the most common squawk code given out by the plane over the course of the data. And again, I told you that some of those are reserved for federal law enforcement, so it shouldn't be a surprise that those variables came out near the top, but I didn't tell the algorithm to do that. The algorithm figured that out for itself. Okay, now I think one of my main take-home messages is I wouldn't want to rely on machine learning for my reporting alone. I viewed it as a rapid screen to find planes of potential interest. And when I ran it on all of the data, I was asking the algorithm to give me a probability that you think this plane belongs to the class of spy plane. But then with the ones with the highest probability, I was getting documents on the planes. So just to give you an idea, comes from the registration history from one of these aircraft. Nominally registered to something called Early Detection Alarm Systems. Early Detection Alarm Systems isn't an actual company. As we can see from this document, it's a front for the US Marshals Service. Planes also have in the US what are called airworthiness documentation. So if you modify a plane, and spy planes are very heavily modified, that's usually documented because it may have safety implications. And here, this is on a plane for a military contractor called Commuter Air Technology. We see a surveillance camera being put on, and those other devices are all for tracking either satellite or cell phones. So I had a good idea from that reporting what the planes were doing. Just an idea of some of the stories. So I already told you we found the US Marshals Service, which is responsible for apprehending fugitives, among other things. This is a track of one of those planes, and having identified them, then we gathered more data on these planes and watched them over time and waited for them to do something interesting. So this is the US Marshals. Those tracks are around the arrest of somebody on the most wanted list in the United States, exactly what it's supposed to be doing. The middle of that inner circle coincides to the exact time and location of the arrest, which was put out in a press release. But more interesting from my point of view, that's a US Marshals plane flying over Sinaloa in Mexico. The bottom circles are around the time of the arrest of a bodyguard of a prominent member of the Sinaloa cartel. Now that's pretty controversial. Those arrests tend to lead to an escalation of violence, and the involvement of the US in that program in Mexico is controversial in both countries, and it hadn't been documented before we found that, for sure. Okay, so we also found some military contractors. This is that company, Commuter Air Technology, or its sister companies. That's flying over Tunisia after the Bardo terrorist attack, looking for the terrorists there. But this is interesting. Here it is flying over Phoenix, Arizona. Same company, some of the same equipment on board. That's military training. They are training to track cell phones and make detentions in an urban environment, which is what they do in Africa for the US military. And we found that is that plane pictured just before it did that. And we found a lot of other stuff. These are covert planes operated by the Department of Homeland Security, listening in on the border for walkie-talkie communications, other stuff like that. This is US Air Force Special Operations Command training over its base in Florida, as exactly you would expect it to do. This is a plane operated covertly by the Palm Beach County Sheriff. We don't really know why. Local enforcement needed a secret spy plane, but they have one. We were able to show, and many more. So just a few lessons to leave you with, and if I'm running out of time, let me know. Bad reasons to do machine learning, impressing other journalists. I don't think that's the way to go. And we did talk about this, a bunch of us, at the main data journalism meeting in Chicago in 2018. That was who was there. Chase Davis, who used to work for the New York Times and now for the Minneapolis Star Tribune, basically was saying, well, when it might be the right tool is like where you have what I had, a classification problem that's going to be really, really laborious and dull if you try to do it manually. But Rachel Shorey, who works for the New York Times, is pointing out that there are simpler things you can sometimes do, and there are some of her suggestions that can solve your problems also almost as well. My main thoughts on it, I have strong feelings about transparency. I don't like algorithms or methods that you can't look under the hood and really see what they've done. So some of the neural network things are very hard to diagnose. The random forest I used is not. And I would also, as I said, not want to rely on the output of an algorithm alone for my reporting. And I'll leave you with what I think the main role of reporters are here around machine learning. It's understanding how it works so we can hold accountable when it's used in a discriminatory way in other cases. I can talk about these examples in discussion if you like. You may be familiar with them already. One is Google making a really horrible racist mistake. The other one is Amazon revealing how discriminatory its job hiring processes are. So I hope I'm in time. I will switch off my screen sharing and listen keenly to what everybody else has to say.
Okay, thank you. Do you think that in your presentation you say that it shouldn't be you have to give the machine a work you would give to an intern? Do you think an intern could have done it anyway, or is it something an amount of data that a human can?
I mean, so the manual way of doing what I did there would be to, I mean, there probably would be some automation. What I would have done is wrote a program to make a map of the tracks of all of the planes, put each one on an individual map, and then looked individually at all of them. And I would have reliably identified spy planes to do that, but I don't want to look at tens of thousands of maps. And I don't think an intern wants to look at tens of thousands of maps either. So that's kind of what the machine learning was, turning a very dull and long visual classification task into something that could be done from the data in a matter of minutes, essentially.
Okay, thank you. We are now going to listen to Mariam Ahmed. So you are a data scientist at BBC News, and I think you have a presentation also.
And what I'm going to do, Peter, so that you can see the presentation, is that I'm going to do screen sharing on our side.
I like the short answer.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Peter. I mean, it's such a short answer that we don't really need to spend 2 days discussing it. Now we know the answer, we can all just go home, I guess. So my name's Mariam, and I'm a data scientist at BBC News, and it's really nice to be here in Europe, potentially for the last time before Brexit. And it's also really nice to have a distraction from thinking about the general election that's happening very soon in the UK. So it's lovely to be here for loads of reasons, and thank you for having me. So I'm going to be picking up on this theme of, will robots save journalism? My short answer is no, and I'm going to explain why I'm slightly cautious, in the same way that Peter is slightly cautious about how and when we should use machine learning and automation in the newsroom. And I'm going to explain how we use data science and those sorts of techniques over at BBC News in London. But to explain why I'm slightly cynical about machine learning in the newsroom, it's probably a good idea to go back to 2016 and talk for a bit about how I ended up at the BBC, because my background isn't in journalism. So Marianne mentioned earlier in the break that a lot of you have come from non-journalism related undergrad. So stick your hand up if you didn't do something journalism related for your bachelor's degree. Okay. Now leave your hand up if you did a sciencey subject for your undergrad degree. Okay, there's a few of you. So I've got a few kindred spirits in the audience. So I started out in engineering, and back in 2016, I was finishing up my PhD in machine learning over in Oxford. And this is a photo of me campaigning in the run-up to the Brexit referendum with two people who were actually very good friends, but out of respect, I've blanked out their faces. Around about this time, I was writing up my thesis, and I'm sure all of you who've ever had to write up a thesis or even a very long essay, or even any of you who've had to write an email that you've been putting off for a long time will know that there's nothing more that you want when you're doing that than a distraction. So I got very distracted with the Brexit referendum, and I started to think about how the same sorts of statistical and mathematical and programming methods that I was using for my academic work could actually be applied to political data and could be applied to increasing transparency and scrutiny and accountability in the public sphere, which is essentially what journalism and data journalism and public service journalism are all about. So I started to analyze political data sets using data science, and coincidentally, around about the same time as I was finishing up my work in Oxford, the BBC were hiring, and the job description was essentially come over here to London and work in Broadcasting House and get paid to do the same thing that you were doing for fun. So I'm very, very lucky now to be in the data journalism team at BBC News. And what we do in our team is this amazing combination of investigative work and storytelling and journalism and problem solving with maths and statistics and code and common sense and using curiosity and all those basic journalism skills. So for us, data science is a combination of stats and programming and subject knowledge, and we apply those three skills to find news in messy data or to tell interesting stories in a way that the public will actually care about and find useful. And throughout this talk, I'm going to put a huge amount of emphasis on this subject knowledge, because without the subject knowledge, you can apply the fanciest statistical or machine learning or data science methods with the most complicated bit of code. But if you apply methods without understanding your data and without understanding the real life processes that generate your data, you're going to draw silly or, in the worst case, misleading or inaccurate conclusions. So I think me and Peter definitely share a point of view when it comes to the importance of sense checking and sort of applying human judgment to interpreting your results. So I'm going to start off by just giving you a quick overview of the sorts of stories that we've worked on over the past year that have used some aspect of data science or automation. We don't actually use machine learning very much. I'll explain why shortly. But this is a story that came out in September, and we used data science methods to analyze the targeting of political advertising in the UK. And the data source we used to do this was this quite interesting tool called the Facebook Political Ad Library, which Facebook made available to anybody who's got access to the internet in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and it was sort of part of their attempt to increase transparency around political ads. So if you Google Facebook Ad Library at some point that's not right now, you'll see that you can see a breakdown of everyone who's running a paid-for political ad and has declared it in the UK or in France. And you can also see a rough breakdown of who's been shown the ad, broken down by age and gender. And we can use that information to understand what sorts of messaging is being targeted to different demographic groups. So using statistical methods to grab and analyze this data, we were able to show that the Conservative Party were targeting slightly more emotively worded or slightly more angrily worded advertising towards people over 45 and mostly men. And they were targeting friendlier messaging with emojis and happy videos of Boris Johnson talking about putting more police on the streets and improving the NHS towards younger people. So that was the first work that we've done on targeted political advertising, and it was interesting to work with that Facebook ad library for the first time. We also obviously cover major election results, and around about this time last year, US midterms were happening, and alongside just covering the results, so reporting which counties and which states voted for the Democrats and the Republicans, we also wanted to try to understand the demographic drivers behind the election result. So to do that, we used a couple of very simple methods. One is linear regression. I'm sure at some point at school you will have all drawn a straight line through some points on a graph. That's basically what we did. We used linear regression to understand which demographic drivers were probably contributing most strongly, or which demographic drivers were most strongly associated with states and counties that voted for Trump versus Clinton. And of course, we have to be very careful about how we report this kind of thing. It's not sensible, and it's not necessarily grounded in evidence to say people with college degrees caused the Trump victory, or people living in rural areas caused Trump to be elected. We can report on things like counties with lots of residents living in rural areas tend to vote Republican, but we have to be very careful about drawing conclusions and saying that one thing caused another. So that's one important caveat that I would definitely highlight when using any kind of statistical method or machine learning, is that we have to be very careful when we're saying that one thing is causing another thing. An example of how we use automation and apply it to political data in the newsroom is our reporting on votes in Parliament. So of course, every time MPs are voting on a Brexit deal or a piece of legislation that's important or related to Brexit, that's something that we want to cover, and we want members of the public to be able to look up their local member of Parliament and see how they voted on a piece of legislation. So we use an automated process that grabs the results of a vote in Parliament as soon as it comes out, within seconds of it coming out, and analyzes it and cleans it up, and we're able to generate these interactive lookups where people can go and see how their MP voted within a few minutes of a vote happening in Parliament. And it's only because of automation that we're able to do this, and obviously this provides a really valuable service for members of the public. And we've published around about 20 or 25 of these in the past few months. So we've been getting a lot of use out of this automated script that grabs these results and sticks them online in this format. We've also used data science to report on the best place to live in the UK if you're young. So as part of this big interactive project, we gathered a load of different statistics about all different parts of the UK, including what the nightlife is like, what the unemployment rate is like for young people, what rental prices are like, and we aggregated and weighted all of those different statistics to produce sort of a ranking and an interactive feature where you could sort of enter your priorities and find out the part of the UK that is best suited for you to live in. And surprisingly, Cardiff is number one in this case, followed by Nottingham and Liverpool, which as a Londoner I'm slightly upset about, but I think it's only fair that we give other parts of the country a chance. Yeah. The last example I'm going to show you is our reporting on the gender pay gap, which is possible thanks to automation. So in the UK, as of last year, all companies with over 250 employees have to report their gender pay gap statistics by April of every year. And this goes up to a total of about 10,000 companies, and every day new companies add their statistics to the database. So we developed a script that checks this database every single day, identifies companies with unusually large pay gaps, and we do this using quite simple statistical methods, again, because it's important that everything we do is transparent and easy to understand and easy to explain and isn't needlessly complex. partly because it's important for us to be able to communicate it to the public, but also we need to be able to communicate it to our non-technical colleagues. And if they don't understand what we've done, or if the person writing it up can't understand what we've done, that's a problem. So we identify companies with unusually large pay gaps so they can be automatically flagged, and we can have a journalist manually look into them and report on them if necessary. And we also develop this interactive feature which lets users type in the name of their company and see the gender pay gap explained in easy to understand terms that would be okay for a member of the public to read, even if they were completely terrified by concepts like the mean and the median. And we've got this quite nice visualization here, which again is fairly simple, but demonstrates the point that most companies have a pay gap that's skewed in favor of men. So I'm going to go back to some reasons why I'm a bit cautious about the overuse of data science or machine learning without the application of common sense or without that element of human sense checking. So data science is great for helping us with problems like, I need to grab and process huge amounts of data from the internet or from this database, or I need to clean up all of these data points. It's great if you want to monitor a data set for changes, just like we do with with vote results in Parliament or with the gender pay gap database, where you've got hundreds of companies being added every day. And it's really good for making visualizations. And in the same way, machine learning can help us with questions like, does one thing predict another thing? So in Peter's example, that would be, does a plane's flight pattern predict whether it's a spy plane or not? It can help us identify patterns and groups in our data, and it can help us find anomalies. So in our case, is there a company that has an unusually large pay gap or potentially a suspicious-looking pay gap? But it can't apply human judgment. And human judgment is always going to be incredibly important in all stages of what we call the data science workflow or the data science pipeline. So the process of coming up with a question or formulating a data science question, grabbing and preparing your data, analyzing it, so whether that's simple descriptive statistics like averages, or whether that's something more complicated like machine learning. And in the interpretation and presentation of your results, human judgment is incredibly important in all of those stages. So a typical situation for us in our team is that a correspondent from some other part of the BBC will come to the data team with a question that's not very specific. It might be something like, is the government popular, or do men earn more than women, or is the NHS, the National Health Service, doing well? So the first bit of human input that's needed in that process is actually translating these quite vague, fuzzy questions into more specific and measurable questions that can actually be translated into a data science problem. So instead of, is the government popular, we might look at what polling figures are like, or how the government's vote or the vote share of the Conservative Party has changed over the past few years. Instead of talking about whether men earn more than women, we might start using terms like the median pay gap. And instead of talking about whether hospitals are doing well, we might start looking at waiting times for a particular sort of operation. So the first step is translation. The second step is finding good data. If you stick bad data into your analysis, you're going to get silly results out. So the sort of mental checklist that we tend to run through when we're thinking about where to get our data from is this data from an official, trustworthy source? So a trustworthy source is not always going to be official, but for us, a lot of the time they are. So that could include open government data, it could include data from a respected think tank or an NGO. It's also important to know how the source organization actually collected that data. So if the data is based on a survey and you can't see how that survey data was collected or how the organization actually selected their sample, that's probably going to start ringing alarm bells. Obviously, is the data easy to get hold of? Is it in some horrendous format that's going to take months and months to actually turn into something useful? And is it free to access? Lots of data is open and free to access and use, and we have permission to use it, so it's under something like an open government license where it's free for you to do anything you want with it. But some data isn't. For example, if you're grabbing data from Google Maps or for an organization that lets you have data up to a particular limit and then starts charging you for it. It's also important to know what the data means. So I'm guessing at some point in your careers you will have been sent a spreadsheet or given a database where the column names are complete gibberish, or they're very vague. So you might have a column that just says quantity. Quantity of what? So it's really important to understand what's actually in your data set, and also to know what's not in your data set. So to understand the limitations, what's missing from your data set, where are the missing values, what can and can't you conclude based on this data set. And the next bit of human judgment comes into the analysis process for us. So the first question that we ask ourselves is, do I really need to use machine learning? Is it going to be completely sufficient to draw a straight line through my data and use something like linear regression? Is it enough to calculate simple descriptive statistics like the mean and the median? And this is, as somebody coming from a technical background, sometimes quite painful, because I obviously have an instinct to want to use the fanciest, most advanced analysis that I can, because obviously I want my colleagues to look at what I've done and go, ooh, that sounds fancy. So it's often a case of really having to stop yourself and manage your own expectations, but also having to go to your non-technical colleague who wants you to run deep learning on this problem, or like do some AI, and say, actually, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something much simpler, but it's going to be much easier for you and everyone else to understand, and there's a much lower chance that I'm going to mess up and get it wrong. And it's also going to be much easier for your colleagues to check, because making your work easy for your colleagues to review and sense check and do code reviews is also incredibly important. And finally, the interpretation step. It's really important to understand your data. So one good example of this is thinking about the vote results in Parliament. So we noticed when we first started writing code to get information about how MPs voted, that some MPs just never appeared to vote. And I didn't know much about parliamentary procedure at the time, and British parliamentary procedure is super weird. So I'd noticed in my data that there were some MPs that just never ever voted. So obviously I went to one of our politics experts in-house and said, what's the deal with this Lindsay Hoyle guy? And there were a few others. Why don't they ever vote? And if I didn't have that expert telling me that Lindsay Hoyle and those few other MPs who I just thought were super lazy actually were not allowed to vote because they held ceremonial positions in Parliament, I would have just assumed that, these people just don't bother showing up. But because we had that person who had the expert subject knowledge of parliamentary procedure, we were able to report this person's voting patterns in a responsible and an accurate way. The second thing is not to draw silly correlations, even if your data looks really convincing. So this is an example of something we did report. So we noticed that counties that had really high rural populations tended to vote for Trump. But actually a much stronger correlation was that counties that had lots of people living in apartment buildings tended to vote for Clinton. That was a really, really strong correlation. I think it was one of the strongest. But it obviously wouldn't have been sensible to report that as people living in flats vote for Clinton, because obviously that would have been a proxy for lots of other demographic factors. So resisting the urge to just grab the strongest correlation or the strongest or most convincing looking result without sense checking it and thinking, does this actually make sense when I think about the real world, is also a mistake to avoid. And lastly, it's important to give meaning to your results. Even when you've got some really compelling results that come out of a really good, strong methodology, it's important to actually add meaning to them or annotate them or interpret them in a way that will make your audience care. And I really like the way that Peter did that by sort of demonstrating the fact that they were able to identify different kinds of spy planes or different arms of the FBI doing different things. And this is a nice example that I've actually taken from the Financial Times. And this was John Byrne Murdoch, who is at the Financial Times. This is taken from a tweet of his. And he explained how it's important to, not just publish a scatter plot that looks like this, but to actually label different portions of it so people can actually understand, those dots up in the top middle of that chart correspond to people who are English and tend to vote for Brexit. Or those people in the left-hand side are in very safe Labour seats. So actually applying interpretation and giving your results meaning is incredibly important as well. So that's my quick summary, hopefully didn't go too far over time, of what we do in our team and the sorts of projects that we've covered, and also how we try to be fairly cautious and careful about applying machine learning and data science in the newsroom. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Do you have any questions on this presentation? Not yet? Okay. So we are going to keep moving with Benoît Raphael. So you're the father of Flint, a personalized newsletter, which is based on machine learning methods. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit more about your project.
Okay, so I am a former journalist, and now I have a job, a new job. It's a job of the future. So my job is I'm a robot trainer, or you can say artificial intelligence trainer. So I'm teaching to robots how to do good things. And the idea is to help artificial intelligence to curate good quality content and to personalize this content. And with that we try to bring quality and diversity. What are you doing? Okay, I am working at Flint Media, so if you want to try, it's flint.media, so you can find the robot. And what artificial is trying to do with us is to bring quality and bring more quality and more diversity to our audience and newsfeed. And maybe are you going to ask me why do artificial intelligence need to be educated, and educated by a journalist or by an expert? It's because there is a big lie behind artificial intelligence. There is a big secret. I don't know if you know the secret hidden behind the artificial intelligence. You know what it is? No. The big lie, you know it? It's that robots are really, really stupid. And there is no intelligence behind artificial intelligence. And that's why we need teachers like me to teach them. And if you just take the news and your newsfeed, the newsfeed you have in your social network, you know that they can't protect you from fake news, because they don't understand a word about that. You can explain them what is fake news, but if you go on YouTube, and if your children are going to you, or your sisters or brother are going to YouTube, they still find fake news on YouTube, and the algorithm can't do anything. And maybe you have a feeling that you are trapped in a bubble. You always see the same content, always see the same buzz, the same debates on the same subjects, on the same topic, and at the end you are bored. So, and all that is because robots are stupid and algorithms are stupid. Even if you have hundreds and hundreds of developers who are coding some new algorithms, they still are stupid. So, how do you educate robots? Before, if you really need to understand, because we are talking about machine learning and robots, if you really need to understand what is artificial intelligence, you need to understand how it works really. I don't know if you know how it works. What is the difference between machine learning, deep learning, and all that? The first thing you need to know is that machine learning, it's a long story. It's not really new. So I'm not exactly doing a job of the future. So it's an old story. And I don't know if you knew, but it wasn't the UK army or the American army who saved France during the last war. In fact, it was an algorithm. It was a robot. It was a UK robot. And do you know which robot it was? Well, I think that in the UK, they had difficulties to recognize that this guy really saved Europe. To be more precise, the robot didn't save Europe, it just helped the Allies to save 2 years of war. So it helped the Allies to Europe to save maybe 1 or 2 million lives. So you know who it is? Yes, our Enigma was the machine, the Nazi machine, actually. But the guy, Alan Turing, he built a machine to decode the code of the Nazi machine because they needed to detect the movement of the troops. And the problem he had is that to decode that, to crack the code, he needed to have a lot of data. And they needed to process this data in 24 hours because Enigma was changing the code and the password every 24 hours. It was impossible. So there was too much amount of data and not enough time. But they had the methodology. They exactly knew how to crack the code, but they just didn't have time. So he just built a machine that just reproduced the methodology. So just reproduce the expertise of a human, just to crack the code. Bless you. And so when you are talking about artificial intelligence, you are just talking about that. So you have a problem, you know how to solve a problem, and so you just automatize. So you have an expert who just you code the methodology, and then you go on automatization. The difference now is that mostly it's just like a recipe. You have your recipe and you just put different ingredients in that, and then you have something good. But the real difference now is that when the problem is too complex, and for instance, how can I choose and recognize good quality content? For you, maybe it's easy, but for a robot, it doesn't understand. How do you recognize a dog from a cat? It's easy for you, it's easy for a child, but it's not really easy for a computer. So when you don't know how to solve a problem, then you use machine learning. So you bring all the data you have, and then you ask the robots to find a rule to solve the problem. And that's what we call machine learning, and deep learning just a more complex way to use machine learning. And of course, when you are talking about machine learning, so you are talking about learning, so you are talking about teaching. So that's why I'm a robot teacher, because I need to teach the robot how to recognize good quality content. And because I don't have the rules, I just try to train him, to help him to find its own rules to detect good quality content. I don't know if at this stage you understood what I said. Okay. And so how do you train a robot, now that you understand how it works? So you train the robot with data, and also you train the robot with control. And it's very difficult as a teacher, because when you are a teacher in a human school, it's difficult, because children can be really complicated, but when you are a teacher in a robot school, it's very complicated, because robots are really stupid, and to understand how stupid is a robot. For instance, I don't know if you have a brother, or maybe not a child, but a brother or sister of 2 years old. If you want him to make the difference between a cat and a dog, how many times do you show him the cat? 2 times? 3? 1? Well, it takes 3 or 4 times, but the robots, you need to show him the cat 1 million times. So you are going to say it's okay because a robot can think very fast. But now imagine you are a teacher and you are a child. He's very, very stupid, and he's thinking very, very, very fast. It's just hell, because he makes 1 million more errors than a human. So you really need to fill in with good data and a lot of data, you understand, because if you don't do that, it doesn't understand. And then you need to have a lot of control, and control the robot every time. And if you don't do that, you have what we call bias. And bias is very natural in algorithms. The algorithm, it is just a very simple way to describe the world and the rules. And every time you automatize these very simple rules, you just go away from the reality. So you need to have control every time to control that the robot doesn't slip too much away from the reality. And that's why you have bias, when you ask a robot to recognize a man in white blues, the robot says it's a doctor. But when you show the robot to recognize a woman in a white blues, do you know what it says? It's a nurse. Why? Because the data, most of the data comes from white geek American in California, and so you need to train them. And information is exactly the same with the fake news. So what we did, because we can't educate a social network from the robots from the social network, we decided to create our own robot school. Because what's going wrong with robots, with algorithms from social networks is that they don't have any teachers. But in fact, you are robot trainer for them. So you are teaching your own robots on social network, but the problem is that you don't know what kind of data you send to them. And the second, you don't have any control. You can't say Facebook or Google that they are wrong. And so there is no transparency. So the robots just go crazy. With a huge amount of people, a huge amount of content, it's practically impossible to be protected from fake news and to have personalized, good quality content. So that's why we try to work very slowly. And we bring with us more than 400 experts, and human experts who now are training more than 1,000 robots on different topics. And we also analyzed more than 20,000 experts on Twitter. And we analyze, and the robots analyze how these experts are acting with information. And it took us 2 years to do that, and we have not finished. But now, so you understand now that it's not exactly when you are asking you the question, are robots are going to replace journalists? You understand that if you really think that you are going to be replaced by algorithms, maybe because you as a journalist you are working like an algorithm. And so the future of that is that it's a more combination with human expertise and algorithm. And we consider that algorithm they are just tools that we can use, and not journalists that will replace us. So if you have a question or if you want to engage a conversation about that.
Can you actually train any robots?
Sorry?
Can you, is it possible to train any robots to get better what they do?
Yes, in fact, if you go on the flint.media, you can have your own robot and you can train it. So it's more general topic robots. But when you're an expert, so you have a paid subscription, and then you can train your own robot on very specific topic. For now, because it's a very small school, and robots are very young, so we don't want them to be disturbed, or to have bad influence from extremist people, or I don't know. So we don't make any marketing around the product. I just talk about Flint in conference on internet, and people come like that. And mostly people they have heard about Flint by a friend. So now we have, after 2 years, we have 18,000 subscribers, and they all are training their robots. And now we are trying with them a new experiment, because all what we are trying to do is also to questioning all the time people about the way they get their information. Because I think that the real problem is not fake news, it's not bad journalism, because you have good journalists, you have good news. The real problem is the way we get our news. And how can we have a better information? How can we be well informed? And it's not just a question of journalism, it's also a question of trust in journalism. It's a question of transparency. So you need to understand why this algorithm send me this content, and 1 time and 2 times. Is this content important for me? So we try to ask all these questions and to open a conversation with our subscribers. So 1 month ago, I launched a new newsletter. It's a new project. It's called, just like the Sunday Times for Flint, it's called Sunday Flint. It's not a good name, but it's a Flint Dimanche, and it's an open conversation, and we try to co-build with our community a project to try to see what could be the best way for us to get informed, to be informed. So we try to use machine learning and all the artificial intelligence of Flint just to have some to get some news, some stories. Then we try to see if we can have some diversity of opinion between all these stories, or diversity of sources. And we try to see which part of algorithm we need to bring to the process, and which part of humanity we need to bring to the process. For instance, if you want to have trust, I need to be transparent and explain to people how did I get this story. But also, if I want to have trust, it's good to have an algorithm, because the algorithm, if it is transparent, the algorithm is objective. If I just say, okay, the algorithm will bring you on this topic 10 stories, but with 10 different opinions. So you can make your own opinion. And I think that when you are talking about saving journalism, I think the real question is, it's not exactly that. It's to help people. It's to educate people to empower themselves, to learn how to be well informed. Because there is so much chaos outside, but it's not just a chaos. It's also, you have a lot of things. We need to help people to learn how to get their news, and to have a critical mind about what they're reading and seeing on the internet. So this is what we are trying to do, this conversation with the robots, with humans, and try to explore with them what is the best way to be well informed.
I have a question for Mariam. As you highlighted at the beginning of your session, very few students have a scientific background. So what would be your advice for young journalists who want to know the basis of data analysis and know how to use the tools?
Sure. So I think the first thing that I'd emphasize is just not to treat data or data journalism as though it's fundamentally any different from conventional journalism. This is sort of an issue that I come across a lot at work when trying to communicate with non-technical colleagues or journalists who don't have a numerical background, is that they just suddenly freeze up and become completely terrified when you show them a spreadsheet or even a couple of numbers. And I always just want to emphasize that the same skills that you'd use to figure out whether a human source was reliable if you were interviewing them, those are the exact same sorts of questions that you want to interrogate your data with. So stuff like, is this the reliable source that applies to data? Is this data telling me the whole story, or do I need to get information from other sources? Does this pass a sense check? Is it reliable? Those sorts of questions are exactly the same sorts of things that you want to bear in mind when you're interrogating data. So I think just not being afraid of data, trying to steer clear of this mentality of, oh, I don't do data, or I'm not a scientist, so I can't interpret this. Actually, if it's good data, and if the person who's trying to communicate it to you has done a good job of collecting it, you should be able to understand it, even if you're from a completely non-technical background. And if you can't, that's probably going to ring alarm bells for me. So I think that's the first thing I bear in mind. Second thing is that there are plenty of amazing free resources for anybody that does want to actually go a little bit further and start to self-teach data science and data journalism skills. So I'd highly recommend looking into any sort of free online courses around programming languages like Python and R, which are quite user-friendly, I think, and quite easy to get started with. But I think actually just those basic data literacy skills is what I'd emphasize to start with.
Thank you. Peter, you also mentioned the cases in which data analysis is relevant, but you went a bit fast on that. Can you maybe come back to those situations where data analysis is relevant?
I'm terribly sorry, I couldn't hear very well. What was the question?
In your presentation, you talked about the cases in which data analysis is relevant, but a bit fast. Can you maybe come back on that slide and explain in which cases it can be useful to rely on data?
Well, we're maybe talking about two things. I mean, where it's useful to rely on data, if there is data, like if you're not looking at it, that's an issue. I was more talking about when machine learning, as opposed to simpler methods of asking questions, might be appropriate. And I think the slide might be the one where Rachel Shorey was, I was paraphrasing some of her points that she made. So for instance, like if you're trying to classify documents, now you can do all sorts of complex things with statistical analysis of text and training an algorithm to recognize certain documents as being one class or another class. But it may well be that just making that text searchable and having a subject expert know a few keywords that would do that will get you there much quicker. That it was that type of thing that we were talking about here. I mean, it's really, what is an algorithm or automation good for, and when is it overkill? When is it just creating a lot of sort of fancy work where fancy work isn't necessary? And if we talk about automation, I think like one of the best examples of automation in the newsroom I'm aware of, and it's been upgraded recently, but it's been around for a long while, is something the Los Angeles Times operates called QuakeBot. And what that does is it takes the alerts of earthquakes from the US Geological Survey, instantly puts them on a map, and starts writing a story that initially is the very bare bones, right? Which is, this earthquake happened at this location that had this magnitude. That story goes in, gets published on the LA Times website with no human intervention. But then a reporter comes in and reports out the story and fleshes it out. And I think like that isn't machine learning, that's just straightforward automation by a robot. But I think I don't know if that helps. I know one question that people wonder about is should we be afraid that robots are going to take our jobs? I think my answer to that is if you're afraid of that, you're almost certainly doing the wrong job. You should be trying to do things as a journalist that match the skills of a human, rather than things that a robot could do just as well and quicker. Because robots, they may be stupid, but they are quick. Computers are really quick at doing dumb stuff.
Yeah, I'd like your opinion to all of you about this question. So, can robots replace some journalists? And do you think it could be, well, I mean, a shame if some journalists just don't get a job at, I don't know, editing or something, because a robot can do it? Do you think the media can only rely on robots and this type of missions?
Well, I've been trying for 2 years, and the answer is no. I think that, as Peter said, robots are very good at a dumb job. You know, so they can be very fast to do very stupid things. So if you, as a journalist, you are on the ground and you work in newspaper or even in a TV channel, and you ask yourself, okay, maybe what I'm writing is really, I can write this story every day. It's the same story, the same data, and I always tell the story the same way. Maybe you can be replaced by a robot. So if you comment a match, for instance, it's very easy because if you have the same data, you can write the same stories. So robots can be used to write some very simple stories and save you time to do the real reporting and to go on the ground and to verify your information and maybe to do data journalism. Robots, they can also help you to have some maybe weak signals. For instance, at Bloomberg, they use algorithm to go to analyze some data, some indicators, to have some signals about country, about the economic situation of the countries. You can also, and there is a real extraordinary tool I just saw 1 month ago. It's a tool that helps you to record a podcast, an audio interview, and then it just transcribes the text of a podcast, and then you can do the cuts with just cutting the text. And when you cut the text, it cuts the audio. So it's really extraordinary. And and there is another functionality that is quite scary but cool also. The name I will tell you in a minute. And there is another cool functionality but quite scary also. If, for instance, you ask a question to your partner and maybe you want to change the text because it's not exactly the good sentence. So you just change the text in the software, and then the voice will change also, because the robot can speak with the same voice, with the same tone, but with other text. So you can practically and futuristically create fake news, fake audio. But it's also very cool when you want to change the audio. So as a journalist, it can be really a very good tool. And I will give you the name of a product in a minute, if I can find it. You also have another software which is really cool. The name is Trint. I think that you know it. Just when you record an interview, it just transcript everything, and you can. So it's very useful when you are doing longer investigation.
Okay, so maybe we can take some questions from the audience. If you want.
Yes, the name of this fantastic tool is a Descript, like a description, descript.com. So you can use all the functionalities, but the fake news functionality you can't use it. You need to ask them to have it. So it's not sure that you are be able to create fake news.
Yeah, so the question was whether data journalism can be used to help build trust between the media and sort of people on the ground or between audiences. To an extent. So I agree that data journalism is a really powerful tool, and it opens up lots of different methods of scrutiny that aren't available to you if you're not sort of data literate. So let's think about some conventional methods that the media might use to scrutinize public figures or government bodies. So the first is obviously the interview. There was an interesting example on Sky News a couple of days ago where the chairman of the Conservative Party was due to be interviewed on Sky News, allegedly, and the Sky News presenter explained to the audience on live TV that this interview at short notice, for whatever reason, wasn't going ahead. And so she sat and just spoke to the empty chair and explained that she would have asked him this, and she would have asked him that, and she would have asked him that, but he's not here to answer it. I think one example of where we have found data to be a really powerful tool is that it can supplement being able to interview somebody directly. And of course, if you're interviewing a politician or a public figure, there's no guarantee that they're actually going to answer your question or give you the information that you've asked for. And in that case, just having the ability to very quickly grab and process and make sense of and search, for example, every speech that politician has ever given in Parliament, or being able to search everything that they've ever said on social media, and use that as an alternative method for scrutiny where those face-to-face interviews aren't so powerful, or where that ability to interview somebody isn't there. That's incredibly powerful. If we think about another method of, in the days before the internet, if you were trying to investigate the paper trail behind a company, you might have to go to a company's house physically, where all of these records about a particular company were stored, and you'd have to go to some dusty filing cabinet and pick out all of their tax returns from the past 10 years and then sift through them manually. Now we have online records where it's suddenly very easy to sift through hundreds of thousands of files or documents about companies, or think about the Panama Papers. Data gives us the ability, or data science gives us the ability to quickly make sense of documents and files in a way that we couldn't before. So it's an incredibly powerful tool. It can supplement, I wouldn't say replace, those conventional methods that journalists would use, and that can be a way to help build trust, or to have more quantitative or evidence-based reporting. I think that, if I'm being super cynical, I'm not convinced that on its own is enough to build trust. Because, of course, having reputable reporting around those numbers is what makes people care about what you're saying. If you just present some raw statistics and say, oh, this shows that this, nobody's going to care. You actually need the good, responsible, rigorous journalism around those figures to grab the attention of the public and present them in a way that's going to build trust.
Someone else?
Yes, so you are asking that we need to feed robot with good data, and what is good data and what is bad data. I think that maybe Peter and Mariam have a different answer, but when you are talking about machine learning and data, for instance, when you want to train a robot to recognize a cat from a dog, or a car from a bicycle, or you use a data set of images, because it's very difficult to get these images, so you use always the same data set. So IBM Watson uses the same data set by a lot of software. The data set, for instance, is the ImageNet. And you can go there and you can try to test the robot, and you see that it's really dumb. The problem is that if you don't have enough data on one topic, or if, for instance, you just have white people and male who just put tags on images. So, for instance, you can say that when you have so some researchers have realized that on picture of men in a kitchen, most of the time the robot recognize a woman in the kitchen, because even when the human, feed the robot, sometimes the man in the kitchen, no, it's not exactly normal, so it must be a woman. So bad data you need to have a balanced data, and mostly all the data are not very good, because every algorithm is a simplification of reality. An algorithm is just like racism; it's a simplification of reality. So all the time you have bias, so you need to control every time. So it's a really combination of data and then the control to avoid the bias. Peter or Marianne?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just going to pretty much agree with what you just said. I think the consequences of having bad data, isn't just that your model isn't going to perform well, but in an extreme case, if you're, for example, building a face recognition system, and as you said, you've only trained it on the faces of white people, then your algorithm is going to learn the definition of what a face is that this computer learns is going to be a white face. So if you show it the face of a darker skinned person, it's either not going to realize that there's a person in that image, or it's going to be more likely to confuse that darker skinned person for another darker skinned person. It's sort of the kind of the computational equivalent of a person saying, well, they all look the same. So I think the consequences of bad data can be more far-reaching than just a bad analysis or kind of unreliable numbers. In terms of how you can tell that your data is bad, I guess we could have another entire conference about this subject. I think in the context of machine learning, we've already talked a bit about the fact that you need to feed your algorithm loads and loads of data points so it can learn how to perform the task that you're trying to automate. So let's imagine that we're trying to build this face detector. One way in which that data set that we're feeding our face detector could be bad is if it's unbalanced in terms of skin tones and genders. Let's say that another way that it can be bad data is if the actual labeling, if we're trying to detect whether there's a face or not in the image, if the labeling that a human will have done that says in each image there's a face or there's no face, if that labeling has been done badly, or by somebody who doesn't really know what they're doing, or by somebody who just kind of gave up when they got to their 1000th image and decided they were going to just do a sloppy job of labeling the rest of them, then your algorithm is going to learn from badly or incorrectly labeled images. Outside the machine learning context and just talking about general data good practice, that checklist that we ran through during those slides is sort of the mental checklist that we would run through. Is it from an official, trustworthy source? Do we know what the data is and what it means? Do we know how it was collected? Is it okay for us to obtain it and process it and use it and publish the results? There's actually an excellent entire textbook about bad data. It's one of those O'Reilly textbooks, and it's one of my favorite because it's got this picture of a goose on the front cover, and it's called the Bad Data Handbook, and that's a really good comprehensive guide as to all the different ways that your data can be terrible.
If it's interesting, I can speak to a specific example from my project, if it would be helpful.
Of course.
So, my algorithm, which I trained, could not tell the difference between a spy plane and a skydiving operation. So, I have quite a few skydiving planes high up in the things that it said. I think the algorithm has said, essentially, I think this is a spy plane, because similarly they kind of fly around in a small area while they're dropping people off. Now, I could have spent a lot of time tweaking my algorithm to get rid of that misconception, but it didn't matter because I was able to tell instantly just looking at who owned the plane and quickly get a map of it and look at it, and I can go, no, that's not a spy plane, that's a skydiving operation. So I didn't need to do it in the data, right? But you can imagine a situation where if you were training an algorithm and you were just relying on it, you'd come away with the idea that there's all of these sort of weird covert spying operations looking at fields in the middle of nowhere. So I think, you know, I mean, I'm back to the reality check, right? Always, whenever you're working with data, whether it's in machine learning or not, look at it. Is the result you got back, does it make sense? Are there weird outliers in it that just can't possibly be true? And that just has to be part of your process all the way through with everything you do. It's like the rest of journalism. The mantra of journalism should be, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. And it's the same with if the data tells you X or Y, check it out. I mean, I think that's, as journalists, we should be natural skeptics, and we should not be enthralled to what data can do for us. We should treat it with the same skepticism we treat any other source, because it is another source. It's not special in that respect, if that helps.
Thank you. No more questions? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Peter. We're just going to end up the sessions.
Yep. Can you still hear us? Peter?
Hello, yes?
Yes, thank you very much for being with us today. That was a great session.
Okay, I hope that was useful. All right.
It was very much. Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.